sex, pleasure, and the human body have long been shrouded in mystery, fear, and taboo. But imagine a time when even the most natural act of orgasm was feared, believed to bring illness, madness, or even death. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, a powerful and pervasive anxiety gripped society. The fear that losing semen, especially through masturbation or sexual intercourse, could drain your life force and kill you. The medical origins of the fear. In early modern Europe, medicine was still deeply influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories. The body was thought to operate on delicate balances of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and semen was considered a precious bodily fluid, formed from refined blood and vital spirits. Semen wasn't just seed, it was the very essence of life, produced through a long process inside the body, sometimes said to take months to form fully. Doctors believed that this essence needed to be conserved carefully. To lose it in excess was to lose your vitality, weakening the body's very core. The condition called spermatoria emerged as a diagnosis in the 18th century, a supposed illness caused by involuntary or excessive loss of semen. Symptoms ranged from weakness, dizziness, fatigue, memory loss, to mental instability and early death. Countless medical treatises warned men to guard their semen zealously, prescribing strict regimens to prevent its loss. Masturbation mania and moral panic. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, fear about losing semen zeroed in on one act, masturbation. Doctors and religious leaders warned that self-pleasure could cause madness, blindness, weakness, even death. Swiss physician Samuel Tisset's 1760 book on the diseases caused by onanism spread these terrifying ideas across Europe and America. Parents and teachers were urged to watch children closely, to stop them from self-pollution. To cure masturbation, strange devices like metal rings and chastity belts were invented, often painful and humiliating. Medical treatments included cold baths, diet control, and even electric shocks. Some places made masturbation illegal, punishing it harshly. This fear caused intense shame, guilt, and anxiety, impacting generations. But toward the late 1800s, science began to question these myths, starting the long road to sexual understanding. Religious interpretations and sin. Religion played a central role in shaping fears around sex and the loss of semen during the 17th to 19th centuries. Many religious leaders taught that semen was a sacred gift from God, meant only for procreation within the bounds of marriage. Any loss of this precious substance outside of that divine purpose, whether through masturbation, sex for pleasure, or even involuntary nocturnal emissions, was considered a sinful waste. Sermons warned that such self-pollution not only weakened the body but endangered the soul, risking eternal damnation in the afterlife. This idea created a powerful spiritual anxiety that went hand in hand with the medical fears of the time. Confession and penance became common prescriptions for those believed to be guilty of this sin. Clergy often urged strict moral discipline and vigilance, teaching that masturbation was a temptation sent by the devil himself. It was framed as a moral failing, a dangerous indulgence that could lead to physical decay and spiritual ruin. In some communities, religious warnings about sexual sins were harsh and unforgiving, shaping public attitudes and private behavior alike. The shame and fear imposed by religious doctrine reinforced medical ideas about semen's vital importance, producing a culture where natural sexual desires were deeply repressed and cloaked in guilt. This combination of religious and medical fear created intense pressure to control one's body and desires. People lived with constant anxiety, not just fearing physical illness or early death, but also spiritual death and eternal punishment. This atmosphere shaped everything from laws and education to family life, reinforcing strict sexual morality for centuries. Female sexuality, ignored, feared, or pathologized, while male sexuality and semen loss were the focus of much fear and control. Female sexuality was largely misunderstood, ignored, or even feared during this period. Medical and religious authorities often dismissed female sexual pleasure altogether, believing women's bodies were fundamentally different and less driven by desire. Some doctors even claimed that women's sexual excitement was unnatural or dangerous, linked to hysteria, nervous disorders, or possession by evil spirits. In many cases, female sexual pleasure was pathologized, considered a symptom of mental illness rather than a healthy part of life. The term hysteria, derived from the Greek word for uterus, became a catch-all diagnosis for countless women exhibiting anxiety, fainting, or sexual desire. Treatments for hysteria were bizarre and invasive, ranging from the use of medicinal herbs to the controversial invention of the pelvic massage, an early form of what we now know as vibrator therapy. Despite the taboo, some physicians acknowledged that women did experience orgasm, but framed it as a problem to be controlled rather than celebrated. Religious teachings reinforced this, emphasizing female chastity and purity while warning that women's desires could lead to moral corruption or social chaos. As a result, many women lived in silence, their sexuality suppressed or misunderstood, caught between medical fear and religious shame. This neglect and fear of female sexuality revealed the deeply gendered nature of sexual repression in history, a legacy that shaped attitudes toward women's bodies well beyond the 19th century. Social and cultural consequences. The fear of semen loss and sexual sin didn't just stay in doctors' offices or church pulpits, it shaped daily life, social customs, and even laws. Marriage was often promoted as the only acceptable outlet for sexual release, but even then, moderation was preached. Sex was framed as a duty rather than a pleasure, especially for men, who were told to control their urges carefully. Young men faced intense surveillance and discipline to prevent masturbation. Families, schools, and religious institutions worked together to monitor behavior, sometimes enforcing harsh punishments or sending individuals to asylums for excessive sexual activity. Public health campaigns warned of the deadly consequences of self-abuse, reinforcing the stigma. This culture of fear controlled not only individuals but entire communities. It reinforced strict gender roles, with men expected to master their desires and women pressured into chastity and purity. The weight of these expectations created an atmosphere of repression, anxiety, and shame around sexuality that influenced generations. Medical devices and treatments. To cure or prevent what doctors called spermateria and masturbation, a range of strange and often painful devices were invented. Metal chastity belts, sometimes lined with spikes, were worn to physically block sexual stimulation. Penile rings, designed to constrict and cause pain if arousal occurred, were sold as medical remedies. Cold baths, restrictive underwear, dietary controls, and bloodletting were common prescriptions aimed at strengthening the body and suppressing sexual urges. Some doctors even experimented with electrical devices, delivering shocks to shock away unwanted feelings. These treatments reveal how medical understanding was deeply intertwined with moral panic. Devices were often more about controlling behavior than healing bodies. The desperation to prevent semen loss led many to endure painful and humiliating interventions. Case studies and personal stories. Historical records give us glimpses into the human cost of these fears. Men and women, young and old, suffered under the weight of medical and religious anxieties about sex. One notable case tells of a young man institutionalized after being diagnosed with chronic spermatorrhea, subjected to repeated bloodletting and forced cold baths. He gradually became weak and mentally unstable, trapped in a cycle of treatment and fear. Letters and diaries reveal stories of children punished harshly for masturbation, sometimes isolated from family or subjected to painful devices. Women struggling with hysteria were often misunderstood, treated as mentally ill rather than cared for compassionately. These personal stories remind us that behind the medical texts and sermons were real people suffering, caught between fear, shame, and a lack of understanding about their own bodies. The beginning of scientific understanding. By the late 19th century, the tide began to turn. The centuries-old fears surrounding semen loss and masturbation started to face serious scientific scrutiny. Medical pioneers like Havelock Ellis, a British physician, began to study sexuality openly and without moral judgment. His research argued that masturbation was a normal, harmless expression of human sexuality, not the deadly sin it had long been portrayed as. Similarly, German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing's work, though controversial by today's standards, shifted focus from moral condemnation to clinical observation. Together, these scientists laid the foundation for sexology, the scientific study of human sexual behavior. Despite these advances, change was slow. Many doctors and religious authorities clung to traditional warnings about sexual excess, but the dialogue had begun. Medical journals published new findings debunking myths about semen loss, while Victorian-era taboos started to loosen, setting the stage for modern understandings of sexual health. This shift marked a crucial turning point, transforming sex from a source of fear to a subject worthy of study and respect. Legacy and cultural impact. Even after the science began to catch up, the cultural shadows of earlier centuries lingered. The stigma around masturbation and sexual pleasure persisted well into the 20th century. Shame, guilt, and secrecy were still common, often reinforced by schools, religious institutions, and families. For many, these feelings weren't easily shed. Adults carried the weight of old beliefs, sometimes struggling with sexual anxiety or shame passed down through generations. However, the 20th century also saw the rise of sexual liberation movements, which challenged these taboos head-on. Open conversations, better education, and changing social attitudes helped reduce stigma and promote healthier views of sexuality. Today, while some remnants of fear remain, a more open, informed approach encourages acceptance and respect for sexual expression. Understanding this history helps us see why sexual shame persists and how far we've come in overcoming it. Reflecting on fear and freedom. Looking back, it's almost surreal to imagine that something as natural as orgasm was once feared as deadly. This history reveals how powerful misinformation, combined with religious and cultural anxieties, can shape lives and societies in profound ways. People lived in constant fear not just of physical collapse, but of spiritual death and eternal damnation, over acts that are now recognized as normal and healthy. Thankfully, today we understand sexuality as a vital part of human well-being. The journey from fear to freedom shows how knowledge, empathy, and education can dismantle harmful myths and heal generations of shame. By learning from the past, we commit to a future where sexuality is embraced openly and without fear, a future where pleasure is understood as a gift, not a threat. Medical myths and popular culture. The fear of orgasms and semen loss wasn't confined to doctors and clergy, it spilled into popular culture. Books, pamphlets, and newspapers spread warnings about the dangers of self-pollution, often mixing sensationalism with so-called medical advice. One popular pamphlet warned, "Every time a man indulges in lustful acts, he hastens the day of his demise." These messages reached far beyond the medical community, shaping public opinion and everyday conversations. Children were raised under the watchful eyes of parents and teachers, taught to associate natural urges with sickness and shame. Stories of doomed youth and ruined health circulated widely, reinforcing the moral panic. This cultural backdrop meant that fear around sex wasn't just personal, it was communal, woven into the fabric of society. Legal repression and social control. The fear of sexual immorality found expression in laws that criminalized masturbation and other sexual behaviors. In various countries, including the United States and Britain, statutes were passed to punish those caught abusing. Punishments ranged from fines and imprisonment to forced institutionalization. Some individuals were committed to asylums for moral insanity, a diagnosis linked directly to masturbation. These laws were part of broader efforts to regulate bodies and behavior, often justified by the supposed need to protect public health and morality. Such legal repression reflected and reinforced social anxieties, controlling not just acts but also thoughts and desires. The role of education and family. Schools and families became battlegrounds in the fight against masturbation and sexual excess. Educators incorporated warnings into health lessons, teaching children that sexual impulses were dangerous and must be resisted. Parents were urged to monitor their children closely, sometimes employing extreme measures to prevent self-stimulation. This created a culture of surveillance and shame around natural development, contributing to anxiety and confusion. Yet, over time, some educators began to advocate for more compassionate approaches, laying early groundwork for modern sexual education. The intersection of medicine and religion. Throughout the 17th to 19th centuries, medicine and religion worked hand in hand to shape public attitudes toward sex. Medical theories about the dangers of semen loss were often framed within religious morals, reinforcing the idea that sexual restraint was both a physical and spiritual imperative. Doctors frequently cited religious doctrine in their writings, and clergy leaned on medical claims to strengthen their moral arguments. This partnership made the fear of orgasm and masturbation a powerful force, binding the body and soul in a web of anxiety and control. The result was a culture where sin and sickness were inseparable. Loss of semen wasn't just a bodily harm but a spiritual crisis requiring repentance and discipline. Gender and power dynamics. The sexual fears of this era also reflected and reinforced broader gender and power dynamics. While men were targeted with warnings about semen loss, women's sexuality was suppressed in different ways, often by denying their sexual agency altogether. Controlling sexual behavior became a tool to enforce social order, with strict codes dictating how men and women should act. Women were expected to embody purity and chastity. and men were pressured to master their urges without succumbing to weakness. These expectations reinforced patriarchal power structures, using sexuality as a means to maintain control over bodies and social roles. International perspectives. Although much of this fear centered in Europe and North America, similar anxieties about sex and semen loss existed worldwide. In various cultures, beliefs about vital fluids, sexual purity, and moral conduct shaped local medical and religious practices. For example, in traditional Chinese medicine, semen was considered a vital essence to be conserved, with excess loss thought to cause weakness and illness. Similar ideas existed in Indian Ayurvedic practices and Japanese folk beliefs. This global perspective shows how deeply ingrained fears about sexuality have been across cultures, though expressed in diverse ways. The role of nocturnal emissions and dreams. One particularly puzzling fear during these centuries was the anxiety around nocturnal emissions, what were often called wet dreams. Men waking up to find their sheets damp were convinced that their precious life force was draining away involuntarily. Doctors and moralists alike debated whether these emissions were sinful or natural. Some viewed them as evidence of secret lustful thoughts, while others acknowledged that they were beyond conscious control. This confusion created deep psychological distress. Men were tormented by guilt for something their bodies did on their own, intensifying the fear of semen loss as an uncontrollable threat. Religious leaders sometimes interpreted these dreams as spiritual tests or punishments, adding a supernatural dimension to the physical phenomenon. The impact on mental health and psychiatry. The anxiety around sexual health fed directly into emerging fields like psychiatry. Conditions like spermatoria were often diagnosed alongside mental illnesses, blurring lines between physical and psychological suffering. Patients complaining of fatigue, memory loss, or depression were sometimes treated for excessive semen loss, even when no physical cause existed. This medicalization of sexual fears contributed to stigmatizing mental health issues, with patients trapped in cycles of blame and ineffective treatment. In some cases, institutionalization and harsh therapies were recommended. Reflecting society's struggle to understand the mind-body connection. Artistic and literary reflections. The cultural panic around sex and semen loss found expression in art and literature of the period. Writers, poets, and artists explored themes of desire, repression, and fear in their works. For example, Gothic novels often portrayed characters tormented by forbidden lust or mysterious illnesses tied to sexual transgression. Paintings and illustrations depicted moralistic scenes warning against the dangers of unbridled passion, reinforcing social anxieties through visual storytelling. These creative works provide valuable insight into how deeply these fears penetrated society's imagination and daily life. The emergence of sexual education. In response to widespread fear and misinformation, some progressive thinkers began advocating for more honest education about sexuality during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unlike earlier approaches based on shame, these educators sought to provide clear, factual information to help young people understand their bodies. Sexual education programs, though limited and often controversial, started to appear in schools. They aimed to dispel myths about semen loss and masturbation, emphasizing that these were normal, healthy parts of development. However, these early efforts faced strong opposition from conservative groups who feared that open discussions would encourage immoral behavior. Despite challenges, this marked the beginning of a gradual shift toward greater awareness and acceptance of sexual health. The influence of Victorian morality on medicine. Victorian-era morality profoundly shaped medical attitudes towards sexuality. The era's obsession with modesty and restraint seeped into diagnoses and treatments. Doctors often viewed sexual desire itself as a dangerous force to be controlled. Patients expressing sexual concerns were sometimes labeled as morally weak or mentally unstable. This moralistic lens influenced how conditions related to sexuality were treated, often with cold baths, bloodletting, or enforced abstinence, rather than understanding or compassion. The intertwining of Victorian values and medical practice helped perpetuate the stigma and fear surrounding orgasm and semen loss well into the 20th century. Technological innovations and their impact. The 19th century also saw the invention of new medical devices aimed at controlling or curing sexual excesses. These ranged from chastity belts and penile rings to electric shock machines. Some devices promised to strengthen the body by preventing semen loss. Others aimed to punish or discourage masturbation through pain. While some patients believed in their efficacy, many of these inventions caused suffering and humiliation. These technological interventions reveal how desperation and fear drove innovation, often prioritizing control over genuine healing. The medical debate over female orgasm. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the female orgasm was one of the great medical mysteries, or rather, medical blind spots. Many doctors outright doubted whether women could experience orgasm at all. If a woman did express sexual pleasure, it was often misunderstood and pathologized. Female sexuality was tangled in confusion, fear, and moral judgment. Some physicians linked female orgasm to hysteria, nervous disorders, or even possession by evil spirits. The term hysteria, derived from the Greek for uterus, was applied broadly to women who displayed symptoms ranging from anxiety and fainting to what we would now recognize as normal sexual feelings. This confusion led to a paradox. Female pleasure was at once denied and feared. On the one hand, it was ignored or dismissed. On the other, it was seen as dangerous and needing control. Treatments aimed to suppress female desire, sometimes through painful or invasive procedures. This contradictory medical stance contributed to the repression of female sexuality, leaving many women confused about their own bodies and desires. It wasn't until well into the 20th century that female sexual pleasure was scientifically acknowledged and better understood as a natural and important aspect of human life. The commercialization of sexual control. Fear is often a market ripe for exploitation, and the panic surrounding semen loss and masturbation was no exception. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, a booming industry emerged selling products designed to cure or prevent sexual excess. Patent medicines promised to strengthen the body, prevent nocturnal emissions, or restore lost vitality. Some contained harsh ingredients like mercury or opium, causing more harm than good. Meanwhile, mechanical devices such as metal chastity belts, penile rings, and elaborate contraptions promised to physically block or punish sexual urges. Advertisements in newspapers and pamphlets used alarmist language, warning readers of the dire consequences of self-pollution while offering quick fixes. This commercialization spread misinformation widely, fueling public hysteria and profiting from it. The fact that so many people sought these remedies highlights the depth of fear and shame surrounding sexuality at the time. It also serves as a cautionary tale about how medical and social anxieties can be exploited for profit. Stories from asylums and clinics. Perhaps the most tragic legacy of the fear around orgasm and semen loss is seen in the stories emerging from 19th century asylums and clinics. Men and women accused of sexual disorders were often institutionalized, sometimes indefinitely. Patients endured harsh treatments, ranging from isolation and restraint to electric shock therapy intended to cure what was often simply natural sexual behavior. Mental illness diagnoses like moral insanity or nervous exhaustion were commonly used to pathologize sexual activity or desires deemed unacceptable. Letters and case notes from these institutions reveal people trapped in cycles of punishment and shame, caught between medical authority and social condemnation. These stories underscore the dangers of conflating morality with medicine and the harm caused by stigmatizing natural human sexuality. The role of women as moral guardians. In the 18th and 19th centuries, women were often cast as the guardians of moral virtue within the family and society. This role placed immense pressure on them to uphold strict standards of chastity, purity, and sexual restraint not only for themselves but for their children and husbands. Mothers were tasked with watching over their children's behavior, especially to prevent masturbation, which was viewed as a dangerous moral and physical threat. Many women themselves internalized these fears, becoming agents of the same anxieties that oppressed them. At the same time, women's own sexual desires were largely dismissed or condemned. This double bind forced many women to live with repressed sexuality, wrapped in guilt and shame, while policing the bodies of others. The moral authority attributed to women in this era both reinforced and perpetuated the sexual fears that dominated society. Early sexual reformers and their challenges. As the 19th century progressed, a small but growing group of early sexual reformers began to challenge prevailing myths about sexuality. Figures like Mary Gove Nichols in America and Havelock Ellis in Britain argued for more compassionate and scientific understandings of human sexual behavior. These reformers advocated for honest sexual education, the acceptance of masturbation as normal, and the dismantling of harmful taboos. However, they faced intense backlash from conservative, religious, and medical establishments. Their efforts laid important groundwork for the sexual liberation movements of the 20th century, but progress was slow and fraught with controversy. changing attitudes in the early 20th century. By the early 1900s, attitudes toward sexuality were gradually shifting. New research in psychology and medicine began to emphasize the normalcy of sexual desires and behaviors. While old fears didn't disappear overnight, the idea that orgasm or semen loss could cause death or madness was increasingly seen as outdated superstition. Sexual education started to become more widespread, though it remained limited and uneven. The rise of psychoanalysis brought new perspectives on sexuality as central to mental health. This period marked the beginning of a slow but decisive break from centuries of fear and misinformation, opening the door to modern understandings of sexual health. Literature's role in sexual fear. In the 18th and 19th centuries, literature played a crucial role in shaping how people thought about sex and its supposed dangers. Gothic novels and moral pamphlets weren't just stories, they were tools that spread fears about masturbation and semen loss. Take Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Beneath the thrilling story of a man creating life lies a deeper anxiety about the consequences of tampering with natural desires. The monstrous creature symbolizes the fear that unchecked passions could lead to ruin, both physical and moral. Similarly, Bram Stoker's Dracula used the image of a blood-sucking vampire to explore ideas of corruption and loss of vitality. This reflected society's deep fear that sexual acts could drain the life force itself. Meanwhile, popular pamphlets warned young people in grim detail about the deadly effects of self-pollution. Parents and teachers often used these stories to frighten children into submission, reinforcing shame and guilt. Together, these cultural stories mixed entertainment with moral lessons, embedding sexual fear deeply into everyday life. The emergence of the vibrator and medical technology in the late 19th century, amidst the widespread anxiety over sexual health and morality, medical practitioners began experimenting with new technologies to address so-called female hysteria. One of the most surprising inventions was the vibrator device, initially designed not for pleasure, but as a clinical tool to induce paroxysms, or orgasms, through pelvic massage. This was believed to relieve the physical and psychological symptoms of hysteria, including anxiety, nervousness, and faintness. Doctors approached this treatment with a mix of clinical detachment and Victorian-era prudishness. Female sexuality was largely ignored or feared, so the vibrator was strictly medicalized. Women were rarely encouraged to think of their pleasure as valid or healthy. Instead, orgasm was a therapeutic endpoint, framed as a necessary physical release to restore health. Despite this, the vibrator provided real relief to many women suffering under the weight of sexual repression and misunderstood medical conditions. Its invention highlights the contradictions of the era. Sexuality was a source of fear, yet also a subject of medical intervention, and paradoxically, empowerment, though largely hidden from public view. The vibrator's existence hints at shifting attitudes toward female sexuality, attitudes that would evolve slowly over the following century, eventually contributing to sexual liberation movements. Cross-cultural views on sexual fluids and vitality. While Western medical thought obsessively focused on the dangers of semen loss, many other cultures around the world held their own deeply rooted beliefs about sexual fluids and vitality, often linked to ideas of life force and spiritual energy. In traditional Chinese medicine, semen was regarded as G&J, a vital essence that must be conserved to maintain health, longevity, and spiritual power. Excessive loss was thought to weaken the body and mind, leading to premature aging and diminished vitality. This belief was intertwined with broader concepts of balance between yin and yang, where sexual activity had to be carefully regulated. Similarly, Indian Ayurvedic medicine emphasized the preservation of virya, or vital seed, associating its loss with physical and mental decline. Sexual moderation was a key principle, believed to conserve energy necessary for spiritual growth and physical well-being. In Japan, folk beliefs and Buddhist teachings stressed the importance of controlling sexual desires and maintaining purity to prevent spiritual pollution. Sexual excess was seen as a threat not only to individual health, but also to social harmony. These varied global perspectives reveal a common human concern: the link between sexuality, vitality, and the very essence of life. Understanding these cross-cultural views broadens our perspective on how deeply embedded fears of sexual fluids are across human history and geography. The medicalization of sexual deviance. During the 19th century, medical professionals began to wield their authority over sexuality more aggressively, categorizing behaviors once seen as sins or moral failings as diagnosable mental illnesses. Masturbation, in particular, became pathologized as a dangerous disorder. Terms such as masturbation, insanity, smotteria, and moral insanity proliferated in psychiatric literature, legitimizing harsh treatments aimed at correcting perceived sexual deviance. Patients exhibiting sexual behaviors outside the norm, especially women and children, were vulnerable to being labeled mentally ill. This medicalization extended control over not only bodies, but also minds, as doctors claimed scientific expertise to regulate morality under the guise of healthcare. Treatments ranged from behavioral therapies to invasive interventions, including physical restraints and even surgeries. Though these developments were touted as advances in medical science, they often reinforced social stigma and punished natural expressions of sexuality. This era marks a critical point where medicine became a powerful tool of social control, perpetuating fears and misunderstandings around sexual behavior for decades to come. The influence of phrenology and pseudoscience on sexual morality. In the 19th century, alongside the rise of legitimate medical science, pseudosciences like phrenology gained wide popularity and deeply influenced how people thought about sexuality. Phrenologists claimed that the shape and bumps of the skull revealed personality traits, including tendencies toward moral virtue or sexual deviance. This supposed scientific method was often wielded to judge an individual's character, justifying social prejudices and moralistic fears. For example, certain cranial features were interpreted as signs of uncontrollable lust or weakness, especially among marginalized groups. Phrenology's appeal lay in giving physical proof to anxieties about sexuality, providing a convenient excuse to ostracize or control those deemed unfit. While today we recognize phrenology as baseless, its influence reveals how flawed science can reinforce harmful stereotypes. It also shows how the obsession with controlling sexual behavior extended beyond medicine into the realms of social hierarchy and discrimination. The lingering shadows of sexual myths in the 20th and 21st centuries. Despite scientific advances and changing social attitudes, many myths about masturbation and semen loss stubbornly persist well into modern times. These old fears continue to show up in popular culture, health misinformation, and even some education systems. From myths about masturbation causing blindness or infertility to confusing misinformation about sexual health, remnants of past hysteria remain. Social stigma often surrounds open conversations about sexuality, causing unnecessary shame and anxiety. Understanding the deep historical roots of these beliefs is essential to dismantling them. Only by recognizing how centuries of fear and misinformation shaped current attitudes can we fully move toward healthier, more open discussions about sexuality today. Personal stories of sexual liberation and healing. Amidst the heavy atmosphere of repression and fear, countless individuals found ways to reclaim their sexuality and break free from shame. Memoirs, letters, and personal testimonies from the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveal intimate journeys of liberation. People described overcoming internalized guilt and societal condemnation to embrace pleasure, self-acceptance, and bodily autonomy. These stories remind us that human desire is resilient, persisting despite centuries of moral and medical oppression. They also highlight the importance of education, empathy, and open dialogue in healing sexual trauma and fostering healthier relationships with ourselves and others. As we've seen, the history of fearing orgasms and semen loss is more than just a strange medical curiosity. It reveals how deeply culture, religion, and science can shape the way we understand something as natural as human sexuality, sometimes with terrifying consequences. These centuries of fear and misinformation left scars that still echo in modern attitudes and myths. But by learning about this past, we take a crucial step toward breaking those chains of shame and misunderstanding. Sexual health is a vital part of our well-being, deserving openness, compassion, and facts, not fear. If you found this journey through history as fascinating as I did, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into bizarre, forgotten, and fascinating stories from the past. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Have your own thoughts or experiences related to this topic? Drop a comment below. I love hearing from you, and if you want to support the channel, consider sharing this video with friends who might enjoy learning about the strange corners of history. Thank you for watching, and remember, understanding history helps us better understand ourselves.